Okay, so before starting, as usual, a few words about the schedule. Today we are here, Thursday, 10th of April. We will have a lecture on Monday, and then a lab on Tuesday, and then you are, let's say, free for Easter vacation, okay? Until Monday, 28th of April, okay? Just remember this. And next lab will be about what we are going to explain today, okay? So you already experimented a little bit with React. So you started using React. I hope you created some components and from the basic data structure you have, the film library, you created a list of films in a table, okay? Dynamically with React. Dynamically, from the code, from what you define in terms of the structure in the code. And today we are going to talk more about the state, okay? So something that allows us to make the application more dynamic. Okay, and you are going to experiment it on Tuesday. And okay, good. So, well, we don't want to, waste the time. So, about components and state. That's the outline. The point of React is that we had these functional components. And we say these functions are pure functions, so the result, the return value that you decide to write, only depends on the parameter that you pass, on the props, okay? That's what you should have done in the lab, okay? So I have a function, I pass some props, actually React pass some props, and then these props, plus the behavior of the function, defines what should be rendered, and we wrote the return value in terms of JSX, so that syntax that looks like HTML, right? But we also say they should be pure functions, so only if you change props, the return value should change, so the render, the way in which it's rendered should change, okay? So we have no way to, let's say, save information inside components, so create a state of the component, okay? We have no ways to execute side effects and many other things that are actually needed in a web application. Okay, so today we are going to overcome this problem by looking at how React allows us to define states and use some state variables, so something that keeps the information between one call and the other of the component. Okay. Okay, we can define a handler function, but indeed without the state they are not useful. Indeed, in the lab you didn't do that. Okay, and there are different ways of implementing the state in React. Actually, we are going to see the more widespread one. Actually, I would say today is basically the only way in which people use a state in React. Okay, it was proposed not really from the beginning of React, but only from version 16.8. I remind you, we are at version 19. But just to give you a temporal reference, more or less, it's like 5 years ago, almost, no, 6 years ago. Okay, so the mechanism is very, very stable. Okay, and can be used really, without problems in your applications. Okay. In short, the mechanism relies on this hooks, and hook is you saw this. That's the hook. Okay, so it's a way to attach something to our functions. Okay, some code to our function to define this behavior that cannot be inserted directly inside our function because they need to be pure functions. We cannot break this assumption of React. Okay, and these hooks, there are different type of hooks, and we are going to see the first one, which is the hooks that allows us to define a state, and this overcome the limitation of the pure function, but in a controlled way. So these hooks, in short, are provided by React, by the React library, and so they interact correctly with the React mechanism of rendering, You remember the virtual DOM that is then translated into the actual DOM, so it updates the content of the browser window and so on. And basically, we will have one hook call for each requested functionality. It means we will call functions defined by React, and they implement different functionalities, different features. One of these features is preserving a state. Okay. So there are many different types of hooks. We are going to see only 3 in this course, but it is not a limit. I mean, they are quite enough for our purposes. The rest is more about optimizing the applications, okay? But these 3 ones, especially the first 2 ones, are the ones which are really important for web application. Without these 2 ones, we cannot write a useful web application, because the first one, the state, we are going to see today, allows us to define the state of the application. So it keeps track of some state variables that we need to have in our application. And the use effect, we will see it later, not next week, but after Easter. It allows to define side effects, in particular to load information from the server. That is the other really important feature that we need to have in a web application. And then the use context helps in simplifying the code sometimes, but it's not really fundamental. But since it's very useful sometimes, I mean, we would like to introduce it to you. And it's also quite quick. Okay, so components. This is the overview of how a React application works. So that's the element tree. That is what you define with the JSX in the return statement of the pure function of a component. And so we have the components that returns this element tree. And this element tree can pass props in the form of attributes to child components and so on. But what can the component do? Well, the component receives props, okay? Just received, you see the arrow is just one direction, okay? And we just read props, we cannot modify props. It doesn't make sense to modify props in React. It can receive other information through the context. We are going to see it later, and can also do some modification, but again, later in the course. And then there is this state that we need to address today, and this is bidirectional. So we can read the state, but we can also store information in the state. That is why it's useful and it's different from the props. Okay? Good. So the state is where a component holds data, the information, and the state is local to a single component. So it's up to us to decide which component should have a state and define this state. And this state has to be put in a place in the application. So it means in a component that makes sense. And we will discuss about this, of course. The rest is props, which indeed are immutable pieces of data, but we just receive props. We cannot do anything with props. And context, just to give you an idea, because I introduced it, it's a sort of global props that we can pass without passing attributes at each level of the tree. Okay, but more details later in the course. Remember that the state is private to the component. Okay, and it can be changed, so it's mutable, only from inside the component, only from the inside of the component. So I need to call the function inside the component that defines the state. Okay? Okay, good. So in React, you pass props, and we saw last time, you saw in the lab how to pass props. They are attributes. They can be any value. You can take these values through the props argument of the function that define the component in the forms of properties of the props object. Okay? The props can be JavaScript object, that's the most common case, can be even other React elements, because remember that React elements are just translated into JavaScript code, so there is a reference that you can pass around in case you need to pass elements for some reason. Okay. Regarding the state, we need to tell React that we want a state. Okay, and the function call is called useState. Okay, everything that starts with use in React, it's an hook. Okay, there will use state, use context, use effect, and all the others that we saw before. You remember the list, right? Use something. Okay, use state is very intuitive. And how does this work? Well, actually, you might remember that when we started talking about React on Monday, I showed you an example with a button that changed the content of the button when you clicked it. Actually, we used the state in that example. I told you don't worry about this, but today we are going to analyze these examples in more details. So the useState creates a new state variable. Okay. Typically, we store what we call a simple value. It means not an object which is, contains all the state of the component, but parts of the state of the component that make sense being together. Okay, we will come back to this point later. Can be an object, can be an array, can be anything that makes sense in JavaScript. So any JavaScript type. Typically, it's either a string, a number, a boolean, or an array, or an object. Okay? Does not need to represent a whole complete component state, so it can be a piece of the state of the component, because we can use the hook, the useState call more than once, and we will see later in other examples. What's the return value of useState? Actually, it returns two things. A reference to the current value, so it gives us something that is usable in our component to define what is rendered or to be passed as props to other children components. Okay, and in addition, also a function that needs to be called when we want to update that state value. Okay, we cannot just take the variable like here, hidden, and write hidden equal to something. This doesn't work because it doesn't tell React that the state changes. If we call the function that React provides us, the function will change the state, but also will tell React the state has changed. And so it will start all the operations of React of computing the new virtual DOM, make the difference with the old, and update the user interface. That's why we need to use the function to update the state that is provided by the React useState hook. Okay? We can update the value, so calling this function setHidden in this case, using two possibilities: giving a new value directly, or giving a callback function to be called to compute the new value. Okay, that's for later. This example is very simple. You see, it's a short text. Okay, that's the name I gave to the component. It's a function that takes props as parameters, as we did until now. Everything is the same. It has a return value that is JSX, span, open and closed, and then some text, simply some text. Okay? You see that we open the curly bracket and then we have a JavaScript expression. Hidden, well, if hidden is true, the expression we would like to write is props.text.substring 0 props max length. Oh, there's a space which shouldn't be there. Okay, sorry for that. So basically it takes a part of the string that is passed as prop in the form of text attribute. Okay, or if hidden is false, props text. Okay, and then there's a link. Okay, an anchor. Just an example. I mean, I could have surrounded the text or put the event handler on the span. I mean, just an example. We don't want to care too much about the fact it's a link, a button, or whatever. It could be anything that can be clicked. And then we attach an event handler, the simplest one, on the click event to this element, HTML element. And what does the event handler do? Well, it simply give a function to be called when the event happens. So somebody clicks, okay? It clicks and the function is called. So it's put on the callback queue. You remember the stuff about JavaScript and how code is executed. When it's the turn of executing this callback is executed, doesn't take any parameter. Actually, that's not really true. It takes the, you remember the event, but we are not using the event here, so we can simply ignore it. And then it calls a set hidden with a new value to be set in the state, okay? And since we need to change the handler, depending on the fact if it's hidden is true or not, because we want to have the handler set the value to the opposite one, we just, again, we open the curly bracket and we decide to render something different depending on the state, okay? So we are using the state in this code to decide what to render, which is perfectly normal. Actually, I would say it's the typical use of the state, okay? Decide what has to be rendered. Okay, so yeah, this is the explanation. Well, of course, we need to import the function. And as I told you, it returns two values, okay? There's this array destructuring assignment to assign two values at once. We saw it when we talked in the beginning of this course about JavaScript. It returns an array with two values, and we can assign them by defining the variables here and with this syntax. It's easy, to write a function like this because with just a single call, we get the two values and they are immediately put into the two variables that are needed later in the code. This is a very typical syntax by which we use the useState call, okay? And this call creates a state variable, of any type. Any JavaScript type is fine. And the important thing is that React, in some ways, we will talk about which way later, it remembers the value of the state variable across function calls. So the next time we React decides to execute our component function, it calls useState. It remembers the fact that the useState has been already called and already created this variable, and somewhere React stored the value of this variable, and it returns the variable to the code so that it can use this value for the rest of the code that we were seeing before. Okay. We can use any type of value. It can be string, a boolean, and a number, etc. Of course, to be useful, typically we use the same type every time. If we have a boolean, typically we want to change it with a new boolean value. If we have a number, typically we would like to change it with a new number, and so on. Okay. But as this is not strictly required. What is strictly required is that we use the set function returned by the useState to change its value. Okay? Because in this way, React knows that it should check the value. If it has changed, it starts the re-render phase. So virtual DOM, difference, and actual DOM. Okay? Okay, so I think let's try the example, okay? I'm not sure I have exactly this example. Well, let me cut and paste it, okay? No, oops. Well. So, we put it into the code that we already used last lecture. So, there's plenty of stuff for today. Let me take the what was it? The my app, I think. Yeah, my app. Let's put. So we need to define a short text component. Okay, somewhere in the code. We just copy and paste. Okay, just a function. Okay, let me format it a little bit better. Okay, so the my button is not needed anymore. Well, we can leave it. But let's leave it. Maybe there's something interesting to see in the code. Okay, short text. Let's create a new row. Okay, and put this short text. Short text. And what should I write here? Well, actually, if the component has been defined by me, I need to look at the props. Okay, so props.text. So there's an attribute text. Okay, text equal to my really nice long text. Okay, and then do I use any other props? No, not for the moment. Okay. I mean, we can run it as it is, but we forgot to import the use state, right? So let me just try. Oh no, that's the wrong folder. Week 07. No, my app and npm run dev. Okay. I think it's this one, right? You see, it doesn't work. Why? I show you just because you are in the lab, you are alone when you are doing the. I mean, you're not alone in the lab, but when you're at home, you are alone. Okay? When something doesn't work, I mean, look at the console. Always look at the console. Use state is not defined. Indeed, you know, we need to import use state. Okay? So, actually, import React, use state from React, or I mean React, well, React not needed, it doesn't matter. Okay, I saved it, and so now it works. Okay, just reload, make sure no errors are here. Okay, good. My really nice long text, more or less. Okay, it doesn't really work, right? It depends on what was the max length. I forgot the props, right? So it's undefined. So I need to modify the code. So max length equal to, I expect a number here, right? So you remember a number is a JavaScript expression into use the brackets, otherwise it's not taken as a number. Let me say 5. Okay, so try again. Okay, and you see the text is abbreviated because it's just a substring. Okay, I click here and it shows the longer version. I click on less, it shows the shorter version, and so on. You might also remember we have this debugger, React debugger. Okay, short text. You see the props, max length 5, text, and my really nice long text. Okay, these are read-only, so they are just useful for debugging. They will not change, because to change them, either the code changes them when they are passed to the component, or you change the code. Okay, and you see the state. State has no name of the variable. It's a long story. I will tell you when it's time, but I mean, this is the first hook, also the only hook we defined. It's a typed state, and it's true now. Okay, so hidden is true. I click here, and it becomes false. I click here, and it becomes true again. Okay, what's happening here? You see the code. When I click, so on the onClick event, this callback is executed, okay? Or the other one, depending on what is the one that is shown. And it changes the state, set hidden, with the function that is being returned by the useState, okay? And it set the state to a new value, which is different from the old one. This automatically tells React, well, re-render the component that contains that state, okay? Because that state defines, and it's here, how the component should be rendered. There's a conditional expression that tells what to show depending on the state, okay? And so after I do set hidden, false or true, everything is handled automatically by React. That's the beauty of React, the beauty of having a framework for handling the state in web applications. We just care about setting correctly the state of the application, and the rest comes automatically. If it doesn't come automatically, you're missing something. There's something wrong in your design of the web application, okay? Because the appearance should be defined only in terms of props and state, okay? Of course, asynchronous events can change the state. Like here, I did it on purpose. On the onClick, I changed the state. That's actually what I want to do. Later in this course, when we will have data coming from the server, this will be an asynchronous event, will be attached with the other hook I told you before, and we will do again a set of a state, and something will change in the interface. So when you have the data coming from the server, you will change the appearance of the user interface, typically including the data arrived from the server, okay? With another mechanism that will change the state of the application. This is a very simple state. Of course, we don't need to have a server to do this because we are attaching a change of the state to an event created by the user. So it's easy. I click and we call this, the code calls the set function of the state and changes the state. Okay? So let's have a look at the button. You remember the button that we had last time? Well, actually, it had something similar, right? Button lang, set button lang, it was useState, okay? So it defined a state, and it had a state that was a string, okay, this time. Actually, I didn't mention yet what's inside here, the useState. That's the initial value for the state. Okay, you need to have an initial value. If you put nothing, it's still fine, but the initial value is undefined. You typically want to have an initial value which is reasonable for your application. Sometimes it can be the empty string, 0, false, true, whatever, I don't know. It depends on what you are doing with the application, and that's the initial state. And then it will evolve depending on how the application evolves over time, depending on the user interaction, the asynchronous events happening in the application, and so on. And so it's more or less the same. So you see the click, and we have this callback function, set button lang. Remember, this is what has been returned by the useState. And in this case, we set a string and not a number. What was it? Boolean, okay? It doesn't matter, okay? The important thing is that at a certain point, we use the state button lang to decide the render of the component, or maybe to pass it as a prop to children. And so something changes in the application. Typically, if nothing changes, the state is useless, right? Because the state should define some behavior of the application, right? Okay. And so the button decides to render in the form of a button with the text ciao or hello. Okay? So just test it. We tested last time. We can look at the button. Okay, just be careful. The state is attached to a specific component. In this case, it's my button. Button is the one that comes from React Bootstrap. Okay? it has no state. Okay, and we didn't write that component. React Bootstrap wrote the component. We wrote the my button, and the my button has the state. And you see here, we have this state that changes when I click IT, EN, and so on. Okay? So, should be quite simple. I mean, the idea is quite simple. You have a state, you tell React to create a state, you modify the state with the function provided by React, and the rest happens automatically. That's more or less the key concept of the React state. Okay, so now we're going to see more details. Yes? A child can see the state of the father only if we pass it as a prop. Okay, so let me see. Yeah, I mean, let's assume this button has some way of. Yeah, I mean, we can use, let's say, not a language but a variant. Okay, set variant. Okay, and. Well, let me primary, okay, and we can pass it to a child, okay. Like here, we can have variant, so it's a variable like any other one, and can be passed to children. Variant, okay, and of course here I need to write either primary or secondary. So we start with primary. So if it's primary, okay, so let's set it secondary or primary. Okay, and let me put hello. Just otherwise it looks like that it didn't change anything. So set variant. Sorry, set variant. Okay. And so you see, here we have a state in this component, but we can pass this state to children components as well. We can use it in the component as well. Okay, let's use it. Variant. So it's just a JavaScript variable. Okay. The only thing we cannot do with this JavaScript variable is assign directly a value to the variable. We cannot write variant equal to something because React is not notified of the fact that we want to change the value. Okay, let's try to see if it works. Okay, there's some issue. Button lang is not defined. I think button lang. We don't use button lang, right? So let me try again. Oh, where is this? My button JSX6. Button lang, sorry, variant. Okay. Okay, now I should work. So let me try again. Okay, no errors in the console. So you see, I have a state, which is now a string, variant, primary, secondary, that both defines what I'm going to show in the button, but also it's something that we can pass to children, okay? Of course, you cannot pass to parents, because props goes from parents to children, okay? If we need to pass something to parents, we need a different mechanism, and we are going to see how we can do these things in case we need them. Okay, let me commit this example. So otherwise you're here to take pictures and so on. I mean, let's try not to state example. Oops. Push. Okay. Hopefully it's online in the week 7. Yes. Okay, good. So thank you for the question. Actually, it's very important. I mean, it's actually the way in which states are typically used. In these toy examples, you cannot really do that much, but when you have a more complex application, you have a state in a component, and then you pass this state to children to be rendered in a nice way. Okay. Example again, the button. Well, actually, I think you understood the mechanism now. Actually, you see, in this example, I mean, I'm not going to try this example because there's no event handler, because who is going to change the state? Well, like here, how it's written here, nobody. So, you know, there's no point in using a state, right? I should have an on-click something on the button so that I can call set English and change the state. But the point here is just to show that UseState needs an initial version of the value to be used when it's first called by React. Okay, so you create the application, so you open the application. React creates all the component tree by calling the function of each component. And calling the function of welcome button means it executes the code. And so the code executes this call and calls useState. Okay? React recognizes this state doesn't exist yet. It creates a state inside that component, and it gives an initial value. That is exactly what you pass here in the parameter of useState. Okay? And you typically want to have a reasonable default value. In this case, it doesn't really matter. But let's say something is active, non-active. You might want to start it with something in an active state, or maybe it's a counter, you start with 0. It's something you need to type, you start with the empty string, and so on. It's an initialization. Okay. All modification to the state must be requested through set variable with a new value. Okay, so the function returned by the useState. You cannot assign directly a value to the state. Okay, what happens is that React will not render your modifications because it doesn't know that the variable has changed. Okay, React is a JavaScript library. It's not an environment that can monitor all the variables and so on. Okay, other frameworks have different approaches. This is the React approach on how to use the state. Okay, and of course we chose React and we need to stick with these rules. So never, never, never modify the state variable directly. Always use the set variable function. Actually, the name should match the variable name, but this is just a convenience. I mean, it's just for our convenience, because when we read the code, it's much easier to read this kind of code than having functions named randomly. Okay. One important thing we need to mention, React will apply the modification asynchronously, not immediately. So it means that in the rest of the code, the variable containing the state will still have the old value in case we need to use it. Okay. Just keep in mind, this is an update and it will be made asynchronously by React. Okay, so at the next iteration of rendering, the state will be updated with the new value. Okay, we will see some examples in a few moments when we have a more complex state like a counter. Okay, so how can we update the state? It's easy. We say, well, just call the function, but we also said you can have a value that is the new value of the state, but you can also pass a function. Okay, so why it's useful to pass a function? Well, let's first look at the simple example. The simple example is an immediate value, something that can be computed directly when you call the set function. Well, that's the final value of the state. That's good. I want to have the state equal to false. I pass false. I want 10, I pass 10, and so on. Okay? It will replace the current value in the state. Okay? Typically, it has the same type because if I have a number, I treat it as a number, and I mean, I cannot put a string, but it would be probably something strange for the logic of the application. With the function, I can pass a function instead of a value, okay? So instead of another JavaScript value, that can be, again, the basic values of JavaScript, Boolean, number, string, array, or object. I can pass a function. And of course, inside the set function, React will have some checks to see what is passed is a function or not. If it's a function, I treat it in a way. If it's a value, I immediately I asynchronously set the value of the state as the new value. With a function, this function will be executed as a callback, so later, not immediately. When the new, and it's to be used when the new state depends on the old state, okay? And the function that we pass should return a value that will replace the current state, okay? It must return a new state value, and it must not mutate, so change the passed in state, so the parameter. Actually, you can do that, but it has no effect. So, it's useless. Let's not do it, so we are not confused, okay? So, this is an arrow function, because it's so convenient to write arrow functions, right? But let's analyze this example. This is the parameter, the only parameter of the arrow function, because we only take the state as single parameter of this function that is to be passed to the to the set of the state. And you remember with this arrow function syntax, this is the return value. So we take the old value of the state that is passed by React to our function as a single parameter. We compute the new state and we return this value. Remember that arrow functions, if I have only an expression, this is the return value of the expression, okay? So this is like writing function, open bracket, all step, close bracket, and open the curly bracket, return all step plus one, close the bracket, okay? It's just a more compact way, but what we are doing here, taking a parameter, returning a new value. Doing some computation in general and returning a new value of the state. Okay, it will be React's task to take this new value, the returned value, and put it inside the state of the component. Okay? Okay, so should we use functions or should we use objects, arrays, numbers, strings, and so on in the set of the state? Well, if the logic for computing the new state depends on the current state, you are required to use a function as the way of updating the state. Otherwise, you risk incurring in errors, problems, and so on. Let's see the example. You see, the counter is the easiest example that we can do. If you have a counter, you have a current value, you have a new value that you can immediately compute. It's so easy, +1, right? So we can say, well, let's set the new value as counter +1. This in general works, but in certain cases it might not work because you click very quickly and the update of the state is not immediate, it's asynchronous. So the call to React happens. So we call React with, let's say it was 5 plus 1, 6. But then a second handler comes in and says, again, counter +1. And we call again, set counter 5 plus 1, 6. So we have two set counter 6. Set counter 6 and set counter 6. But we click twice. We would like to see the result as 7, not 6, right? And if you let React execute the function that compute the new state according to the old state, React will not miss the fact that we called the set state twice, so 2 times, and it will call the second time the callback with the new value of the state. So the first time it will be called with 5. We do 5 plus 1, we give 6 back to React. React takes 6, put it into the state, and then it's so that we have another set counter with the function. And so it takes the 6, it gives it to the function. The function does 6 plus 1, 7. It gives back 7, and 7 goes into the state. And so in the end, we have 7, regardless of the speed or whatever it happens in the application, because each user state is counted. Okay, counted, it means it's considered. Okay, count, it's not good here with the count. It's considered. So the callback is called as many times as it's needed, and since it takes as a parameter the old value of the state, it will always has the possibility to compute the new correct value for the state. Okay, so this is the simplest example where you can run into problems. Okay, there are more complex examples. We will see them later. So when the new state depends on the old state, we should use this way of updating the state. Okay, so let React do the computation at the correct time, because the operation is asynchronous. Okay, previous examples, well, they did not meet this condition because we had a final value of the state that did not depend on the previous one. Well, actually, if we want to be precise, actually it depends, but it's not so important. I mean, I can afford to lose a click. Okay. If it's a counter, I don't want to lose a click because I want everything counted. Okay. Okay. So if you have a reset button, that's a final value. I mean, you want reset everything, and you simply click and set the state as the initial value, whatever you want. It's a value that is defined by the application. It does not depend on what you did previously. Okay, good. Okay, so calling state changes. So indeed, if we want to be precise, even in this example, since the new state depends on the old state, we should use the old state to compute the new state. It's very simple when you have a Boolean value because it toggles between two values, true and false, right? So if we do something like toggle, just one single function, it takes the old value and it does the not of the value. So if it's true, becomes false, and vice versa. And by the way, it also simplifies the code. We can write a set of the state passing a function as the new value. Okay, and the function will be called by React when it's needed. Okay, so just have a look at the code. Yeah, like we can modify this code a little bit. So like toggle function, or let me toggle toggle language, toggle this is toggle expansion. Okay, set hidden. Okay, and I don't care about the name of the variable. That's just a parameter of a function, right? E, not E, and so on. I mean, it can be anything. I mean, H, whatever you like. Okay, so here we write toggle expansion. Okay, just be careful. You need to pass here. This is an event handler. You need to pass a function. Okay, you cannot write set hidden true. Okay, so I'm going to change the next one. You cannot write set hidden true. This will not work. If it happens in the lab, it will not work. You call us and we will tell you. But I mean, you will get used to this. This is passing a value. That is the return value of set hidden, which is actually, I don't remember if it says a return value or not. I think There's no return. I mean, I cannot tell you what is the set function returning. I mean, we are not using it, so I'm not sure if it returns undefined or whatever. Okay, but in any case, that's not what we want. We would like to have a function here in the event handler, always a function. Okay, so if you don't have it, you know, the easiest way in which you create a function when you have some code is just open, close the bracket, and put the arrow. Okay, no parameters. Or you have a reference to a function, like here, toggle expansion, right? Oops, toggle. Okay, so just test the code. Where is the code? Yes, it works. Okay, and since we just have one handler at this point, well, we can simplify the code, right? So just do like this: hidden, more or less. And so we remove all this stuff. Okay, and this bracket. No, I missed something. What's missing here? There's some parenthesis that doesn't work. Hidden. Ah, yes. No, span. Okay. No, this is missing. So, probs text. That's the parenthesis that should be opened. That's too much, right? This one as well. Right? Yes. Okay. So again, it works the same, right? So that's the code. I'm going to commit the code now. So you see, I mean, we take the old value and we do the not of the previous value. And so if it was true, it becomes false, and vice versa. And this is the function, okay, that we need to execute when we have this event. Okay, we could also take directly set hidden and write it here. Okay, but I don't want to do too many things at once. I mean, let me commit this. Okay, second example. Let me state update with function. Okay, something more meaningful. Push. Okay, so we now more or less know almost everything we need to know. Okay, so often implemented as an arrow function, of course, because you know state updates, especially when the state is simple, like Boolean or a number or something like this, it's really easy to implement, right? And sometimes you can even write it here, right? So just be careful. You cannot write set English directly, but this is an event handler, so it needs to have a parameter and the arrow, okay? Because otherwise you call the function immediately. You don't pass a function. The event handler takes a function, okay, as the value. Otherwise it executes immediately, and there's nothing to execute when the event happens. Okay, so the default value, so the parameter that we pass here in the beginning, this true in this case. Well, it's used only during the first render of the component, only in this case, okay? Never used in successive renders. So it is actually called with this parameter at every render, but React will simply ignore it because it knows the state has already been created. So it will give us the new value of the state, not the initial one. We know the initial one. The initial one is only used in the first render. It can be a value or a function itself, but in this case it's less useful because a function I just called once in the first render, so I mean yeah, sometimes can be useful for clarity of code, but I mean, don't really use it, okay? It may also be computed from the props, but just beware of the fact that when the prop will change, the state will not change. So it's not connected to the prop. A state is never connected to the prop. If you use the prop for initializing the state, it's just for the first render. And then they goes, I mean, on their way, separate. They are separated. So we saw the example before, right? No, it was in the code, right? So let me show the code. Where was it? I destroyed it. Okay. Well, if you have use state with props, I think that was, yeah, something here, but I destroyed the example, sorry. So use props dot, let's say, first string, so props initial language, whatever you want, just use once. And then if you change the props, the state will not update, okay? Because the state is something independent. It belongs to the component, and it can be changed only by the function that is returned by the React useState hook. Okay? Good. So example, a counter. So we have a counter, and okay, this is exactly this example. Initial count taken as a props. That's perfectly fine, but just beware of the fact that at a certain point you change the value of the props when the application is running, and nothing happens in the state because it's just used once in the beginning. Okay? And so this fragment of code returns the count, so it shows count equal to something, and then it has 3 buttons that have 3 different handlers. One, set count to the initial value, okay? The other increases or decreases the value, okay? I think we can try this example as well. I mean, just to... well, it takes a while to do the cut and paste. I'm not sure if I have the... Unfortunately, I don't have the code. Well, it doesn't matter. We will try it later in case it's needed. Okay, because it doesn't cut and paste nicely. Okay, let's try to finish the discussion about the state, and then we will have 1 hour and a half for experimenting with our application. You remember we have the question and answer stuff, and we have some buttons for voting, and we will make the vote, the button for the votes work. Okay? Okay. Until now, I showed you just one state for one component, actually. Okay? But the useState hook can be called more than once in the same component. Okay? So useState can be used to define a variable, 2 variables, 3 variables, how many variables we would like to have. Okay? Of course, each state has its own set function. So we always have 2 return values for the useState. Hidden, set hidden, useState true. Okay? And if I want to change hidden, I cannot write hidden equal to something again. But I need to use the set hidden. And then I define count. Count set count, useState 0. If I want to change count, of course, I cannot use set hidden. I need to use set count, okay? And so on, okay? And you can define as many states as you need. That's fine, okay? Create as many state variables as needed. They are all independent. They are all monitored by React because each one has its own set function. So if you call the set function of a certain state, React will know which state and which component holds the state, and so which updates needs to be done in the virtual DOM and so on. Components will re-render if any state changes. Okay? So everything is monitored by React. That's the purpose of React, actually. Children components will re-render only if the props passed in the form of states change. So as we did before, you know, the primary and secondary. Here, the button will re-render if there is something passed as prop, in this case this variant, that changes. And React knows which props are passed to which components. Okay, that's the whole point of React. Okay. So in this way, we can have also complex states for a component. We need to have something that is Boolean plus a number plus something else. We don't have to mix everything in a single state, okay? Which would be difficult because you should have an object with different properties and so on, and we will have some rules by which we need to treat the states, as we will see in a few minutes, okay? So actually the older version of React, I told you, you know, since 5-6 years, we are using hooks, so it's much easier to handle states. The older version of React managed only one state for each component. It was much more difficult to use, okay? We're not going to explain this again, and also because it's mostly abandoned, because this mechanism of the hooks works so well that basically everybody writing new application is doing it in this way. Okay, good. So we still need to handle one situation where you might wonder, well, how do we use the state in this case? Okay, let's assume you have a situation like this. You have 4 buttons. In this case, there are 4. And they are mutually exclusive. So like the radio buttons. If you click one button, you want all the others to be unselected. Okay? If you click another, you deselect the first one and you select the other one. Radio buttons. Okay? So in this case, where do I put the state? Can I put the state on the buttons? I mean, 4 states, 1 for each button. How can I ensure that when I change the state of a button, because I click, let's say, go, and the go becomes selected, so it becomes primary since it's bootstrap and so on. But, okay, this is fine. But how I make sure that the other button is unselected? What is the state of the other button? It's in the other state. How do I talk with the other state? Well, actually, that's a problem, right? Where do we put the state? Because we say the state is private to a single component, cannot be accessed by other components. Okay, the function, I showed you the functions to update the state, and we only use the functions from inside the same component. And so, well, actually, you have these 4 buttons, but you have a parent element in the element tree. Okay? And so, if you have a parent, you can put a state in the parent. Okay? And in this parent, you can say, well, out of these 4 buttons, this is the one that is currently selected. And that's fine. Let's say we solve the problem from the point of view of where to put the state. It's in the parent. It's passed to all children. And if the button selected, which is the state, corresponds to my name, I will render as a selected button. Otherwise, I will render as unselected button. That's fine. That's good. But how do we modify the state now? The state is not on the button anymore, and we need to write the event handler on the button, right? So that's the problem. So let's see how we can solve this problem. Okay? So we have a component, this group of buttons, where we said we put the state, because in this way there's only a central place, only one state. This will not be a binary state, selected, unselected. It will be a state that says which button is selected. So basically it has 4 possible values. let's say the names of the buttons, for instance, okay? Or an index or whatever you like, I mean, to define which button is selected. So this is the state, and it's put here in the button group, which is the parent of 4 children, okay, in this example. So the button, okay, that then will render the button, etc. And in this code, we will receive as props, okay, for instance, the fact we are selected or not. Or we can receive the name and check if it corresponds to our name. That's a design issue. I mean, we need to decide how to pass the information. An index, a name, a string, a boolean like selected or not, and so on. Okay? And depending on the props we receive, we will render either as selected or unselected. Okay? Okay, good. So that's the structure. This example is a bit more complex because I wanted to show you something that is not so trivial as the previous one. When you have props, you can make very reusable components. So we would like to write the component of the button just once, not 4 components, each one for each named button, chest, power, whatever. Okay? So besides passing the state, selected or not, we also pass the name. So we only have one component, and we say, well, render yourself, but put this name on top of your button. Okay? So we only write one component, and we will instantiate it 4 times. Okay? Using an array. Okay? Depending on the array, we return a JSX that corresponds to the button component. Okay? And this button component will render itself depending on the props. Okay? So the name, you understand it's what is shown. Selected or not decides the color. And the index is useful for later, I mean, for what we are going to see now. Okay? So, when we need to handle the click, what are we going to do? Well, we need to handle the onClick event from the button, but we saw the examples until now. Okay, they all did the same. And the point is that the button group, so the parent, this one, need to offer a method for changing which button is selected. And this method needs to be available to the children, to the 4 buttons, because the event handler has to be written in the children 4 times for the 4 buttons. So the method reference must be passed down to the simple button element together with the other props. So we can pass props in the form of strings, numbers, arrays, objects, and so on. We can even pass reference to functions as props. And that's what we are going to do. Props choose, we will pass a reference to a function. And this function is defined inside the button group, so the place where the set state is available. And we can use it. Okay? So, I mean, here we decided to define another function. We could have passed the set selected directly. I mean, typically it's not so nice from the point of view of the code passing the set function directly, because, you know, sometimes you might want to change something, and, you know, this is a function that is supposed to be local to the component. So if you pass something else that just call that function, that's better. But it's just from the conceptual point of view, because there are no distinctions between functions in JavaScript. Everything that is a function can be passed around, as you know, in JavaScript. Okay? And so what is missing, what was missing before was props chose. So a new props that passes the function to be called by the simple button components on the onClick event to choose which button has been selected now. Okay? And that's why we wanted the index. We could have used the name, I mean, depending on how you write the code. But since the name is something you want to show, maybe you want to change the name and you don't want to change all your code because somebody wants a new name, okay? So just keep the name separate from the inner workings of the application. So like in this case, we use indexes and that's fine, okay? So we can change the names just by changing an array that is passed to the button group with the names of the buttons, okay? Okay, good. So, yeah, I will prepare the example during the break because I think I forgot to upload it, but I will search where it is or do copy and paste. But let's recap what we have seen before until now, okay? So, handling a state is in general more difficult than handling props, okay? No doubt about this. And so, if you don't need a state, don't use it. But actually, we saw sometimes we need to use the state. Okay, it's fine. Use the state. Think well where you need to place the state. Sometimes you need to move the state to common ancestors or parents. Okay? It's called the state lifting. It is always done in these React applications. You will see at the exam probably most of your state will be in app, that is the parent component of the whole application. It's not the best way of programming, but for small application it's still fine. Okay, we don't have time to deal with how to make better things for the state. That is fine. Why we need to move the state to the parents, the ancestors? Because if it needs to be passed as props, it needs to be in the parent. Okay, only the parent can decide which props have the children components. Okay, but moving to the parent means to modify it, we need to pass functions to the children when they need to modify it, as we did with the previous prop. Okay, props choose, this one. Okay, and there's nothing wrong in doing this, it's fine. Okay. And so to allow children to ask for state updates, pass down callback functions, as this one, the choose button, set selected index and so on, okay? And then the rest happens automatically. If everything is designed correctly, you don't need to care about renders and so on. React will render correctly if every piece of your user interface depending on state and props. So you just need to make sure that states and props have the correct value. That's all. The rest is React's task. Okay, you don't care. And that's why React was designed, to take care of the update of the user interface according to the props and especially the state of your application. Okay? So, last slide, then we will break for a few minutes. So some tips. When should you do the state lifting? So bring the state up to the parents or ancestor components. Well, typically in some components you have presentation state. So something that decides how to show the stuff. We saw the string, right? A shortened or expanded. That is a presentation state. It doesn't really affect the fact that we want to show that string. Just an issue about how to show it. Okay? Typically, those states stay in the component that decide how to show the information. Okay? Then there is application application state. Okay? So information that the application needs to show. And typically that state is something that you want to lift, go up in the element tree until you find a common ancestor, a common parent to all the components that need to use that information. Okay? And sometimes it will be up the root of the tree. Okay? That's fine. Okay? The states that contain the application state are often called container components. Okay, they contain this state. The other ones are called presentation components because they might hold state, but it's only interesting for showing information. Okay, it's not about I have a list of data and so on, like the list of fields, the list of answers and stuff like that that we will use in our application. Okay. Typically, application components do not directly generate markup elements. Okay, I mean they require to use to render some components, but they delegate to the components what has to be shown in the interface. Okay, so they are higher level components where you put the state and you decide how the information is propagated through the application. While presentation components receive the information typically through the props and show the information. So they render the button, the text, the paragraph, the list, the element of the table, and so on. Okay? Okay, good. So I hope this is more or less a good explanation of the state in React. And of course, we need to translate everything we saw until now into practice. So in the next hour and a half, we will see the button example. Okay, so I will search on the computer and make it available to you. And then later, we will see how to manage a more complex state. That is what you are supposed to do in the next lab. So having a list of objects, like the list of fields you have in the lab or the list of answers we have here at the lecture, and we will see how to handle the list, okay? Which is, of course, a little bit more complex. There are a few, let's say, small subtleties that we need to, make sure we follow to have everything working correctly, okay? I think that's all if you don't have any questions, and so we can break 10 minutes, more or less, and we will resume with some examples. Okay? Thank you.